If you've spent any time on Twitter since Elon Musk took over, you've probably seen stuff like this. In case you didn't know, Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, is a big fan of that Twitter account. Meanwhile, libs of TikTok who spouts hoaxes and marshals bomb threats against hospitals tweeted, "The average IQ in Somalia is 68, with an image of a Somalian American guy running for office here in America. And there's evidence that these sorts of national IQ maps are influencing policy.
You look at Haiti, you look at the demographic makeup, you look at the average IQ. If you import the third world into your country, you are going to become the third world.
Now, anyone actually with an IQ over 60 should take one look at these national IQ stats and doubt the results. I mean, how could anyone get a representative sample of the IQ of people in war-torn Mali? Do they honestly believe the average person in South Sudan is actually mentally defective? I'll do a little spoiler here. The source they get this from is absolute garbage. They estimate Somalia's national IQ, for example, by using Ethiopian child refugees in Israel. Let's dive deeper to show why these statistics are completely and utterly fraudulent. If you get in an argument with someone who cites these bogus stats, maybe you could send them this video. This is What, Why, How, and that's what the video is about. If you like this sort of thing, don't forget to like and subscribe, and why not check out my Patreon for early access to future videos. Okay, all these national IQ maps trace their fundamental origins to a few works published around the 2000s, written by Richard Lynn, an English psychologist, and Tatu Vanhanen, a Finnish sociologist. Fun fact, the second guy's son was the Prime Minister of Finland. The first guy, Dick Lynn, wants white people to secede from America to protect white civilization. And it's not like he published his national IQ pseudoscience before adopting his radical political project. He's been calling for eugenics since the 1970s. Everyone else abandoned it, his dad didn't, so he loves it. In 1974, Lynn reviewed a book called A New Morality from Science, Beyondism, and said, "What is called for here is not genocide, the killing off of populations of incompetent cultures, but we do need to think realistically in terms of phasing out of such peoples. If the world is to evolve more better humans, then obviously someone has to make way for them, otherwise we shall all be overcrowded. Better hope Richard Lynn doesn't decide you should be phased out." Anyways, my point is that Lynn is not a geneticist, he's a highly political and biased interloper from psychology. But let's get into the actual works by Richard Lynn and Tatu Vanhanen that all these Twitter posts come from. IQ and the Wealth of Nations, that's 2002, IQ and Global Inequality, that's 2006, then in 2019, Lynn and another guy wrote The Intelligence of Nations. Each of these books covers the same ground, so imagine them less like sequels and more like new versions of the Civilization games. So, what's the issue? In order to make any solid claim about the average IQ of entire nations, you need solid evidence. Obviously, no one has actually given an IQ test to everybody in an entire country, so you need to take a sample of that population. As anyone who's taken a stats course should know, in order to be representative, the sample has to be large and random. Sampling one specific subgroup or quizzing too few people won't get you accurate results. Scientists have done many IQ test experiments, but they're often of specific subgroups, like students, or immigrants, or pregnant mothers. This is actually completely fine. Most scientists want to study that specific subgroup. The issue comes when you pretend those subgroups represent entire countries. Despite this obvious fact, Lynn and Vanhanen twist the scarce available evidence to manufacture those national IQ numbers. So if you scroll through their data for their second book, which everyone still looks at despite being outdated by the third book, dozens of national IQs are calculated using tiny tests, often with less than 100 people. For example, Ethiopia's national IQ of 64 is estimated using a couple hundred teenagers. Equatorial Guinea's national IQ of 59 is estimated using 48 10 to 14-year-olds. It's just more of this crap. Now, it's probably worth pointing out that the authors aren't just taking the IQ of children at face value, they are adjusting them for age, but that obviously adds another uncertain estimate to the equation. These are countries with millions of people. There just aren't a lot of IQ tests given outside the first world, but that does not mean you can just extrapolate and apply tiny samples of specific groups to whole countries. Scientists have a responsibility primarily to the truth. These flaws should be obvious. I'm literally just looking at what they themselves wrote down. But if you dig a little deeper into their sources, you can see even more significant flaws. For example, let's look at their Ethiopia citations. Lynn 1994b, and Kazulin 1998. When you go to the bibliography at the end of the book, 1994b is sex differences in brain size and intelligence. Okay, so that's an obvious miscitation. They meant 1994a, the intelligence of Ethiopian immigrant and Israeli adolescents. Wait a minute. Ethiopian immigrants. Yep, he uses a study of Ethiopian immigrants to Israel. Now, it should be obviously true to anyone who isn't grasping at straws that a couple hundred teenage Ethiopian immigrants to Israel, who are presumably disproportionately Jewish Ethiopians, are not a representative sample of the entire nation of Ethiopia. You also have to wonder why these Ethiopian immigrants went to Israel in the first place. Were there perhaps any environmental factors Ethiopians suffered in the 1980s and 1990s, such as a disastrous civil war and a famine, which drove thousands upon thousands to flee the country as refugees? Did those refugees experience additional suffering as they fled their country? Did they have trouble adjusting to an entirely new nation? The answer is yes. Later in the book, the authors both admit that poor childhood nutrition and low education impact IQ test performance. We'll talk about that later. But surely they should second guess applying this test result to the entire country. Anyways, the source is a brief article by Lynn correcting an earlier study that shows that Israeli kids in Israel have a higher IQ than teenage Ethiopian refugees in Israel. The estimated IQ Lynn presents is 69. Not sure why he subtracted a few points to get to 65 in his book, but whatever. If you find the original study though, Caniel and Fisherman 1991, there are even more problems. The authors themselves write, the subjects had emigrated to Israel 1 year earlier. These aren't even well-established immigrants. These are refugees who just arrived from isolated rural villages. As the authors point out, they've had to adjust to climatic differences, life in urban centers, a new language, and so on. Shout out to this article which pointed out some of these issues. Now you might say, so what? Maybe these immigrants will just forever have a low IQ because they come from isolated rural villages. Well, the original study says, delay in the development of cognitive processes as measured by PMS does not imply that the subjects will exhibit low cognitive abilities over the long term. A recent study, Caniel and Suriel, comparing Ethiopian Jews and Israelis, showed that after efficient intervention, the Ethiopian Jews can catch up with Israeli subjects of the same age. That's right, with help, they could catch up with Israeli kids, which suggests that IQs aren't really solid measurements of innate intelligence, but instead your ability or familiarity with IQ tests. There was another study the book cites for Ethiopia's IQ, Kazulin 1998. This is not that additional study mentioned by the original study which said intervention helped, but a different study. Maybe this one actually tested people in Ethiopia? Nope, the title is Profiles of Immigrant Students' Cognitive Performance on Raven's Progressive Matrices. For some reason, the book doesn't say the sample size. Even though the original study does, the abstract reads, 4 groups of new immigrant students from Ethiopia and Israel, N equals 46, participated. Then it adds, the results suggest that the new immigrant students initially had a cognitive profile different from that of native Israeli students. The intervention appeared to be effective not only in improving the absolute score on the matrices, but also in changing the student's cognitive profile. Now, we already talked about all the issues with quizzing new Ethiopian refugees, but that last sentence is a bit interesting. Did the study have multiple test results? Yeah, it did. Students were pre-tested without a time limit. After the pre-testing, students received cognitive intervention in the form of cognitive strategies learning. The learning material includes tasks based on the actual test. The evaluator actively discusses with students the cognitive principles and problem-solving strategies necessary for solving the tasks. The intervention took approximately 4 hours. 2 weeks after the intervention, students were tested again using the Raven's matrices. So the Ethiopian refugee kids were given practice. They probably had very little education in war-torn rural Ethiopia, whereas Israeli kids have a pretty good education system. They're going to be exposed to problem-solving quizzes and puzzles. So what were the results? The scores after intervention showed significant improvement in 3 groups out of 4. The post-intervention performance in Group 1 reached the Israeli norm. So not only did the Ethiopian score improve once the kids were given just 4 hours of training, one group reached the Israeli level. Elsewhere, Lynn estimates the Israeli national IQ to be 95. That means based on the results of this test, just 4 hours of training could boost IQ 30 points. That is massive, and it should raise massive questions about the accuracy of any sort of national IQ estimation. How does the book respond to this information which is in the study they cite? Well, they cite the original low scores to give Ethiopia an estimated IQ of 64. That's right, the authors estimate the entire country's IQ based on less than 300 refugees on another continent whose scores actually improved with some basic assistance. That's just for Ethiopia. There are many, many similar problems elsewhere. I mean, look at the test results for Kenya. Tests vary between 63 and 89. The fact that these test results have such high variance suggests they have low reliability. For a whole bunch of countries, they don't have any studies, so they just take an average of their neighbors. Somalia's IQ of 68, which Libs of TikTok cited, well, the authors just took the averages of Ethiopia's IQ of 64 and Kenya's IQ of 72, and we already covered how flawed those tests were. So half of Somalia's IQ is based on Ethiopian child refugees in Israel who improved with some basic education. Now, all of this stuff is from before 2006, when Lynn and Van Hanen wrote their book. Have they updated their data and sets since then? While proving himself a one-trick pony, Lynn published another version of the book, The Intelligence of Nations, in 2019. This is his most updated one, so ideally it would be the best, right? Just scrolling through the book, you can find all sorts of fundamental issues. On page 49, they say, only one source could be found for Angola, a control group from a study about cerebral malaria consisting of a very small number of individuals from the Central Hospital of Benguela, though the subject's place of origin was left blank because of the low density of hospital beds in Angola. Actually, let's just look at the study. Turns out the control group was just 19 adults recruited from the outpatient clinic. Now they say, patients with other health conditions, either neurologic or systemic, were excluded, but presumably these people found themselves at a hospital for some reason, right? Not only did Lynn take this study at face value as representative of the whole population of Angola, he also changes the results. Here's what he writes. Additionally, the sample scored 41.56 in the symbol search test of the WAIS-3, equivalent to a German IQ of 110. This score would be dramatically higher than the mean from the two other subtests. It is not included here because symbol search is only intended to estimate index scores for special abilities. However, a difference between more than 30 IQ points in different subtests is unlikely. Also, it is not to be expected that a malaria-infected group from a developing country has a higher IQ than a group of healthy people in a Western society. Okay, so when these 19 Angolan hospital visitors score very high on one test, he throws out the results, but when they score below average, he keeps the score because it's what he expects the results to be. So for Angola, the authors exclude people with malaria and only keep the control group. For Uganda, they include people with malaria. They cite a study which is literally called Asymptomatic Plasmodium Infection and Cognition Among Primary School Children in a High Malaria Transmission Setting in Uganda. And believe it or not, that brought down Uganda's estimated IQ. Shout out to Rebecca Sear for pointing out that problem. Let's look at Nepal. For some reason, they have a couple studies where people perform very poorly in Nepal. Lynn translates their national IQ to be around 40, which is intellectually disabled. This is obviously insane. No country could exist if half the people had an IQ below 40. Lynn even says this is very implausible. Even if all used samples are from rural areas, we would expect a national IQ for Nepal not so far below the national IQ of its neighborhood country, India. But instead of getting to the bottom of the issue, he even suggests the tests might have been calculated wrong. He just shrugs off any rational concern and jots down the entire nation of Nepal as having an IQ of 43. Lynn's co-author for this book, David Becker, decided that he'd just give Nepal an IQ of 60 in his own 2023 dataset based on the same results. If these guys don't believe what they write in their book, obviously something significantly wrong has happened, and it should raise questions about the accuracy of other test results. Let's look at Thailand. The studies vary between 53 and 106. For Sierra Leone, they have one study from 1966 from which they calculated a national IQ of 45. They even say the study was very old and used an ethnic minority. We therefore have to look on these results with reservations, but they put it in the book. Nicaragua's IQ of 53 is calculated using children exposed to pesticide, who actually scored better than 1,294 mothers and their 7,475 offspring, of whom 454 were women who had learned to read and write as adults in Nicaragua's literacy program. 457 were illiterate, and 383 had become literate as young girls attending school. Lynn even writes, this national IQ would be untypically low for the geographical region, but just plugs it in anyways. Spoiler alert, Lynn thinks different races have different levels of intelligence, but even on that basis, Nicaraguans are half white. He calculated Mexico's IQ to be 88. Something must have gone wrong with the study. Surely they should look into it as experts, right? But they just include it anyways. Guatemala, similar situation to Nicaragua, except one of the studies produced a result equivalent to an IQ of 33. Remember the whole issue with Somalia? Well, in 2017, we finally got a real study. This one for Somalian refugees in Kenya. There should be obvious signs not to count this study, considering these are refugees who are presumably not in good condition to take IQ tests, but nevertheless, they give an IQ of 68 again. They even say the lack of comparative samples and the nature of the sample itself make it necessary to accept this result only with reservation. Why include these crappy tests then? Why not just say you don't know what Somalia's IQ is? They're so desperate for results, they just extrapolate from crap. For Bangladesh, Lynn has a flawed study about arsenic toxicity, from which 2 samples were taken for Bangladesh, which scored about 75 each. Another study had 2 samples, one from literate and the other from illiterate children. The IQs estimated by Lynn were 90.5 and 77.7. That's right, the literate kids scored much higher than the illiterate kids. Interesting results if you think being able to read should help you perform an IQ test, but elsewhere Lynn says literacy is an effective IQ and not the other way around, so he throws it in the pot with a couple other studies and gets an average Bangladeshi IQ of 74. But wait a second, you might say. 74 is lower than all but one test result. Well, that's because Lynn is weighting all results by data quality and sample size. How does he calculate this, his QN factor? Well, he's multiplying the sample size by the means of the sample rating, testing rating, and method rating. So if a test doesn't seem good, he will count it less. That sounds fair, but it introduces the risk of bias. They calculate Nigeria's IQ to be 73, but then weight it down to 68. They have Oman's national IQ as 85, but then weight it down to 79. They have Puerto Rico's national IQ as 88, but then weight it down to 82. Based on a couple tests, they give Kuwait an unweighted IQ of 89. They weight it down to 88, but then smush it together with school assessments, another of their factors, to bring it down to 78.6, a full 10-point drop. Based on the Botswana tribe in South Africa, they give Botswana, the country, not South Africa, an IQ of 76. They mush that together with international school assessment scores to give the country an IQ of 69. Using IQ tests, the authors give Argentina a 95 IQ, weighted down to 94, but they did bad on international tests, so they get squished down to 87. But guess what? Sometimes they like the tests, so the weighting increases the score. Canada's unweighted IQ is 91, but the weighting boosted to 97.90, but Canada did well on education, so it gets boosted higher to 99.4. Here's an interesting case. In Vietnam, they calculated an unweighted national IQ of 77, then weighted up to 78. Vietnamese school children did very well on PISA, an international test for school children, which then suggests Vietnam should have an IQ of 101, so they mushed them together to get a final Vietnamese IQ of 89.53. Using a couple tests, they gave the Philippines a 90, then weighted up to 92, but then since the Philippines did so poorly on international assessments, suggesting an IQ of 71, they suppressed the IQ down to 81.6. Cambodians scored wildly different scores in studies. One study had an average IQ of 58, another had 80, and another had 102. Surely that suggests that maybe these tests can't be very accurate. Unweighted average gets 80, but weighted average boosted to nearly 100. Isn't it weird that the IQ scores are flipping around so much? Surely that suggests something strange is happening, that this data is not as accurate as the authors pretend it is. Here are some more countries. Hungary gets boosted 5 points, New Zealand gets boosted 3 points, Norway 2 points, and so on. Let's look at this table on page 195. Let me explain it. The dots below the line are countries whose scores get decreased once the authors weighed the studies and added some other factors like geography. The countries above the line see their score increased. Below the line, your score has been decreased, above increased. Countries to the left of 90 IQ on the bottom have an unweighted IQ below 90, and countries to the right have an unweighted IQ higher than 90. Let's look closely. For some mysterious reason, more countries to the left have their scores decreased once they fiddle with the numbers than countries to the right. What a coincidence that their methodology tends to boost the countries they think are smart and smother the countries they think are dumb. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't weigh data. But if there's this sort of systematic pattern, you really need to walk through and think through what the issue is. Now you might say, even with all the weird fiddling, all the weird tests, maybe African countries simply have a lower IQ. Well, then we have to get to the systemic issues with the data. Now, I'm not a psychologist or a psychometrician, but plenty of people who are have criticized Richard Lynn and his buddies for these books. Helte Wickertz and his colleagues, for example, have written a bunch of articles pointing out Lynn's flaws. In 2009, these Dutch critics wrote a systematic review of the average IQ of sub-Saharan Africans. As they write, a sizable portion of the relevant literature was not considered in both Lynn's own review and reviews with Van Hanen. Our own searches and library databases resulted in additional relevant studies. They have no idea why Lynn excluded those additional studies in his 2006 book because he wasn't transparent. But did those studies of sub-Saharan Africans show they had a higher IQ than Lynn calculated? The answer is yes. They list 3 right off the bat. If you look at this chart, you can see nearly all the studies the critics discovered that Lynn did not use had higher IQ results than what Lynn calculated. Here are some more details. Lynn used IQ data from Ferrone, 1965, who provided averages in 7 samples of children from Sierra Leone and Nigeria on a little-known IQ test called the Leone. For reasons not given, Lynn 2006 and Lynn and Van Hanen 2006 only used data from the 2 lowest scoring samples from Nigeria. Most of the remaining samples show higher scores, but those samples were not included in the estimation of the national IQ of Nigeria and Sierra Leone. Likewise, Lynn and Van Hanen did not consider several relatively high-scoring African samples from South Africa. They include a bunch more, none of which Lynn included in his first books. These authors also pointed out additional issues with a test Lynn decided to include. For example, the DAM test is the Draw a Man test, which is exactly how it sounds. But Weikert says in Fahmy's 1964 test that Lynn plugs into Sudan's IQ, these children had an average IQ of around 50 on the DAM, but scored considerably higher on 3 other tests, which are discussed below. Fahmy indicated that the children who had no schooling, never used a pencil, have no experience in how to conceptualize their visual image. Moreover, most of the unschooled children that Fahmy recruited from the bush were naked. It is noteworthy that within good enough scoring scheme of the DAM test, 5 out of the total 51 points are awarded for including drawn clothes. In another study in Sudan, Badri 1965b noted that many children from remote villages hold pencils in unusual ways and state they have never before made a drawing on paper. Lynn includes these DAM tests for Sudan, bringing his Sudan average down to 71. Now you might say, that doesn't look like the 2019 book, that looks like one of his earlier ones. You're right, that's his 2006 book. To give Lynn some credit, he seems to have excluded those Draw a Man scores, found a bunch of other tests to give Sudan an average IQ of 79 in his 2019 book, an 8-point jump once he improved his sources. Interesting. Now, just because the DAM can be biased doesn't mean it is always biased. You'd expect urban school children to be more familiar with using pencils and Western clothing standards, for example. Well, those critics I was reading found a bunch of DAM tests that Lynn did not include. And guess what? It shows that their IQ should be higher than what Lynn calculated. Lynn decided to include some of these tests in his 2019 book, but not all of them. Here's another example of an unrepresentative test that Lynn used to calculate the DRC's IQ. The first problem with these data is that the studies were mainly concerned with the effect of intestinal parasites and malaria on cognitive development. For that reason, the children in these samples were all from underdeveloped rural areas. In some studies, children were specifically selected for their poor health. The critics also pointed out that in some tests where you need to identify objects, items included objects that were rather unfamiliar to these test takers, e.g. telephones. Lynn included data from these tests in his 2019 book anyways, lowering the DRC score. Back in his 2006 book, Lynn had 2 tests for Zimbabwe from a guy named Zindi, which he averages together to give the country an IQ of 66. But the critics point out that Zindi clearly indicated that the WISC-R needed adaptation to remove language difficulties, and he stressed that some instructions and items in the WISC-R may not be appropriate for Zimbabwean children. In a subsequent study, Zindi found that small alterations to the WISC-R greatly enhanced average IQ in Zimbabwean children. It is also noteworthy that the average IQ in the Zimbabwean sample appears to be higher than the figure of 67 reported by Zindi himself. In his 2019 book, Lynn excludes all of Zindi's work and uses just an old study from 1969 to give Zimbabwe an IQ of 74. Here is probably the most shocking paragraph. In the last study with the WISC-R in Africa that Lynn and Van Hanen reported to substantiate their claim of low IQ among Africans, the IQ of a small sample of 10 to 14-year-old children was found to be around 60. However, the use of this sample is an error. The average IQ of the people of Equatorial Guinea is based on a lengthy book chapter. Although this chapter reports research conducted among members of an illiterate tribe in Equatorial Guinea, the WISC-R was not administered to these Africans. The 48 children to whom the WISC, not the WISC-R, was administered were from Spain. not from Equatorial Guinea. Clearly, Lynn and Van Hanen made a mistake in using this sample to estimate average IQ of Africans. Not only were they Spanish kids, not African kids, but they were tested in a school for handicapped children. Even Lynn was shocked at this result in his original book, which was the only test he thought applied to Equatorial Guinea. Back in 2006 he wrote, "It is remarkable that the adult literacy rate is 82 for Equatorial Guinea, although its national IQ 59 is lower than for any other country. You think they would have double-checked their work. Maybe this explains all their issues with Nepal and Guatemala." For their 2019 book, they shrugged and excluded any IQ measurement for Equatorial Guinea. In another example, he included a 1935 test of rural Africans unfamiliar with using pencils. He excluded some results in another test that showed a higher IQ, and so on. Now, a lot of those mistakes seem to have been fixed for the 2019 version, but we've already gone through all the additional mistakes with the 2019 version. For example, Nepal. I'm sure experts in psychometrics will discover new errors that explain the ridiculously low results for several countries. Anyways, using African test results that aren't completely bogus, the Dutch critics calculated an average IQ of about 80. Now, obviously, that is below the United States and other developed countries, but there are clear and obvious environmental factors that would have a huge impact on that, such as childhood nutrition. We'll talk about that later. So, is that the end of the story? Africa has an average IQ of 80. Well, no. As is inevitable with scientists, Lynn published a response paper in which he criticized the critics' inclusion of several studies for being based on unrepresentative elite samples. He defended himself in some cases, but appears to completely avoid some of his more humiliating mistakes, like calculating Equatorial Guinea's IQ using disabled Spanish children. In the critics' response to Lynn's response to their response, they point out that the foremost factor in Lynn's decision to reject a study was not its representativeness, but the IQ result. For example, Lynn rejected as unrepresentative data from the standardization of WAIS-3 among English-speaking South Africans, because it was a well-educated sample. At the same time, Lynn accepted as sufficiently representative a sample of Africans who all had finished high school, had studied for 1 to 2 years beyond high school, or had studied 3 years or more beyond high school. We note that the excluded sample, average IQ well above 80, was carefully drawn on the basis of stratified procedures, while the Klein sample, average IQ of 70, was a convenient sample consisting of immigrants to Belgium. They provide several more examples of Lynn finding excuses to reject all-right test score results, while at the same time not applying that same standard to other studies that present low test score results. He's only applying the rules to the higher test results. This suggests the only basis Lynn is actually using to include or exclude a test is the result of the test. Obviously, you will end up with a low IQ score for Africans if you exclude all the tests they did well on. Here's another avenue of criticism toward the Lynn books. The analyses have shown that national IQs depend partly on characteristics of the samples on which they were measured, even if these samples have gone through a selection process before, and strength and direction of the effects of such characteristics vary between countries of different IQ levels. Different speeds in cognitive development exist between populations with different mean IQs, and were mostly delayed if the mean IQs were below 100. In combination with the different demographic structures of countries, such as between the older Western and younger developing countries, this might be a source of the underrating of the intelligence of low IQ countries. The variations that were mentioned in the previous paragraph also imply that the NIQ dataset is suitable for identifying global patterns, performing quantitative analyses at the cross-national level, but should not be used as an index of exact individual country IQs or to rank countries which score relatively close to each other. Many developing countries had mean scores close to or even within the percentiles where tests lose their reliability. While the tone isn't biting, this suggests that the entire national IQ dataset isn't really accurate or very usable at all. Well, that's from Lynn himself in Book 3. Alright, we've established that the data Lynn uses in his books is deeply flawed. But let's talk about the book some more. First is IQ and the Wealth of Nations, 2002. As the title suggests, their thesis is that the different average IQs between countries has a strong impact on whether those countries are successful. They say, in general, although not without exceptions, nations with more intelligent populations have been able to achieve a higher level of per capita incomes than less intelligent nations. This is a major reason why economic inequalities among nations are so great. They take their national IQ numbers and compare them with GDP per capita to claim, thus national IQs explain 29% of all of the variance in per capita income in 1820 and 52% of the variance in per capita income in 1997 to 1998. So their argument is that IQ not only explains the wealth of nations today, but the wealth of nations over the past 200 years. I want to point out that the national IQs they pretend to have are for the 1900s. However, they feel completely comfortable retroactively applying those national IQs back to 1820, despite admitting that there were substantial improvements in the quality of nutrition of the populations of the Western nations during the 20th century that were responsible for increases in average heights of about 1 standard deviation. The increases in intelligence have been of about the same order. Improvements in nutrition brought about increases in average brain size, and probably also in the brain's neurological development. This is the Flynn effect. On average, IQ scores have risen over time. If anyone tries to retroactively apply IQ to explain economic development over 200 years, you should probably be very suspicious. But I want to expand on an important issue. This is probably fundamental. Here's another quote from IQ and Wealth of Nations. In the least economically developed nations in the early 1990s, around 50% of children under 5 years of age were stunted and about 10% were wasted. That means low weight for height. This means famines, civil wars, and general poverty should have an obvious and significant impact on the scattered, small IQ tests that the authors extrapolate to apply to entire nations of millions of people. People who are familiar with IQ should know this. Why do I bring it up? Well, importantly, their thesis is that IQ drives the wealth of nations, but they admit that the wealth of nations influences IQ. That is the exact opposite of their thesis. Here's how they digest this information. While the general thrust of our argument is that the intelligence level of groups is the determinant of earnings and the other economic and social phenomena, it may be argued that the causal sequence is in the other direction, and that the per capita incomes of groups are a determinant of the intelligence of the children born into and reared in these groups. It might be argued that groups with high per capita incomes provide a better environment for the nurturance of their children's intelligence by the provision of good quality nutrition, healthcare, and education, all of which are known to have an effect on the development of intelligence in children. We accept that a process of this kind is almost certainly present and that it operates in conjunction with a causal impact of group intelligence on earnings and other economic and social phenomena. The process should be regarded as one of positive feedback, in which the intelligence level of the group is a determinant of its per capita income, and the per capita income of the group has an impact on the intelligence level of the children born and reared in the group. In case you missed that, they admit their whole thesis might be backward, but without any real reason, still insist that it's correct. They just believe that IQ has a greater impact on national wealth than vice versa, without any real evidence. The reason I'm highlighting that malnutrition and poverty have an impact on IQ, besides the fact that the authors insist the opposite relationship is greater with no real evidence, is because their second book, IQ and Global Inequality, dives into racial explanations for IQ. After retreading most of the same ground, they have a whole section called Racial Basis of National IQs. On the one side, which we call the environmental side, is the fact that certain racial groups have suffered more than others from poverty, famine, and other things that we know impact IQ, just on the basis of living more in Africa, for example. Most Africans live in Africa. Shocker. And it is difficult to build a healthy, stable society in deserts and jungles and the hostile environment of Africa. Then of course there's the whole issue with being colonized and brutalized for 80 years. The authors admit this. They even write in the book, in the comparison between Africans in Africa and Europeans, the environmental differences between the two populations consisting of the quality of nutrition and health are quite large. But despite admitting the importance of environmental factors, the authors just shrug off this important conversation with just a couple paragraphs of consideration out of 300 pages of text. They write, "It is not possible to determine the relative contributions of environmental and genetic factors, but it is clear that there is genotype-environment covariation." Okay, so how do you differentiate between genetic and environmental impacts if there's no way to determine? Here's what they say about it. However, if the populations have about the same standards of living, nutrition, health, and education, the impact of environmental factors is certainly smaller and the heritability correspondingly greater. To put that simply, you need to compare a racial group in a bad environment to the same racial group in a better environment. On page 246, they do just that by providing their definitely too low average IQ of the continent of Africa, 67, and the IQ of pure and nearly pure Africans in the southeastern United States, which in a substantial sample sample of 1800 has been found to be 80.7. Since the average IQ they've come up with for white Americans is 98, that's 67 versus 81 versus 98. Using these estimates, they then claim that the difference in intelligence between white people and black people are about 50% genetic and 50% environmental. Besides the fact that they're extrapolating from bad data, they seem to have forgotten one thing. White people and black people did not have equal environmental conditions in the southeastern United States in 1963, the date of their study. White and black people in the US today don't have equal conditions either. Taking a sample of 1,800 black Americans from 1963 in the South and using that as your basis for black people in equal environmental conditions as white people today is extraordinarily idiotic. This one tiny and immensely flawed thought experiment, to put it charitably, is how the authors shrug off environmental conditions to confirm the bias they brought in beforehand that genetics explain differences in national IQ. If you remember, Lynn was talking about eugenics 30 years before this book was written, and with this book, he's using scarce, twisted, and overextended evidence to buttress his preconceptions, what he already incorrectly believed. Even then, they have to admit that environmental conditions are still massive. Why does this matter though? Well, since Lynn believes that different races naturally have different levels of IQ, that impacts how we govern our societies, doesn't it? On page 292, they have a section called Policy Implications. While he recommends providing food aid to overcome the environmental handicap of bad nutrition, which I think is perfectly justifiable, he also doubts the effectiveness of monetary aid. Whatever. Here's something I'm going to point out. In book 1, he says, finally, because dysgenic fertility is tending to reduce the intelligence of the populations of the poor countries, it will be advisable for the governments of poor countries as well as for rich countries to support programs designed to reduce dysgenic fertility. By this he means the tendency of the less intelligent to have greater numbers of children than the more intelligent. As we've already established, Lynn is a eugenicist. Alongside believing that white Americans should secede from America, he clearly believes in unexplained methods to reduce the fertility of non-white people. Book 3, published in 2019, is titled The Intelligence of Nations. Despite being updated significantly from 2006, it still has significant data issues which we've already talked about. Based on those shaky foundations, Lynn repeats his same conclusions. This time, he has a much larger section called Positive Eugenics on page 321. He mentions several different eugenics proposals and policies, including Nazi Germany's. Then he has a section on negative eugenics on page 328. Alongside such brilliant quotes as Donald Trump won the presidential election in 2017, the authors list various policies and proposals to block immigration, sterilize people, and so on. Now, they don't outright endorse any of this. They just list the ideas, then later on say they're probably impossible to introduce. They sound a bit regretful about that, if you ask me. Back in 2001, Richard Lynn wrote a book called Eugenics: A Reassessment. In it, he obviously endorses eugenics. There are a bunch of should statements throughout the book, but he also writes about a future eugenic world state. As he describes, China can be expected to use its power to take control of the world and establish a world state. Once China has established the world state, it will be concerned with raising the prosperity of its subject populations. One of its first measures to promote this objective will be to introduce worldwide eugenic programs, such as parental licensing, embryo selection, and the cloning of elites, and eventually genetic engineering. This is something right out of Star Trek: Wrath of Khan, but Lynn seems convinced it will happen. Not only that, but from the text, I'd be willing to bet he thinks it would be a positive thing if China took over the world and started implementing eugenics. In fact, let's look at his memoirs. My Eugenics: A Reassessment was an attempt to rehabilitate the concept of eugenics from its virtually universal rejection from the 1960s in the Western democracies. So there he says it. He supports this. But to close out the video, I want to point out that IQ tests don't really seem to me a good measure of intelligence. For one, you can get better at taking IQ tests without getting more intelligent, which suggests that IQ tests are best at measuring how good you are at taking IQ tests. That's a major issue because IQ is supposed to measure your intelligence ability. You wouldn't really be able to practice an ability, right? But we know from those Ethiopian tests and the authors themselves that education helps people perform better on IQ tests. There are a bunch of other studies that show retesting improves IQ test results. Here's an article that looked at 50 tests which showed scores improved when these applicants retest, and effects were larger when practice was accompanied by test coaching and when identical forms were used. Not only does focused practice help, but so too does general education. A study from 2006 measured an increase of intelligence of 5 points a decade over 35 years in Dominica, showing that this is principally attributable to improvements in education. Guess who mentions that study? Lynn himself points it out on page 320 of Book 3. The fact that education increases intelligence and measurement on IQ tests is widely accepted. What's my point? Well, I don't think I need to tell anyone that the education system on average across all of Africa is just not good. Here's a study that points it out. Averaging across countries, 44% of teachers in Africa were absent from class, either because they were absent from school or in the school but not in the classroom. Moreover, even when in the classroom, teachers may not necessarily be teaching. We carried out classroom observations as part of the survey, recording a minute-by-minute snapshot of what the teacher was doing for a randomly selected 4th grade mathematics or language class. The percentage of the lesson lost to non-teaching activities varied from 18% in Nigeria, the country with the lowest classroom absence rate, to 3% in Uganda, the country with the highest classroom absence rate. Students are taught on average 2 hours and 46 minutes per day, or roughly half of the scheduled time. Not only is the education system bad in Africa, a continent which is on average very poor, but it's also exploitative and abusive. Teachers abuse pupils or extort money in exchange for good marks, permission to graduate, or even to obtain textbooks. School children have a nickname for such predatory practices: sexually transmitted grades. Guess where I found these quotes? That's right, Lynn has both in Book 3. He even makes this joke: "This practice is likely not conducive to good educational attainment." Lynn even writes, "Part of the explanation for the positive correlation between national IQs and educational attainment appears to lie in the poor quality of teaching in much of sub-Saharan Africa." With these facts undeniable, he advocates for improvements in education systems. But because he has no measure of how much IQ can be attributed to education and environmental factors like nutrition, he still considers racial genetics to be a determining factor and therefore advocates for discriminatory eugenic measures. So I think I've proven my point that this whole thing is bull crap. If you have any comments, let me know below, and if you want to support the channel, you can do so on patreon.com/whatwhyhow. For $1 a month, you can get early access to future videos, thanks to those who already do, and thank you for staying and watching this long video. Adios.